What we know about restaurants is it's a huge industry. It's $1 trillion in the United States. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of restaurants. And people love restaurants. They've spent more and more of their disposable income on restaurants. None of them are making any money. That just can't possibly be the right answer. We, as consumers, are too willing to support restaurants that we love for restaurants to then turn around and report zero profits.
And be
it
struggling.
doesn't make any sense.
It's a hard business also.
It's definitely a hard business. It doesn't have to be a hard and broken business.
There we go.
It can be a hard but solid business.
Welcome back to the Slow Hunch. I'm really excited this week to welcome to the show Ben Leventhal. Ben is currently the founder and CEO of Blackbird, and previously has founded companies including Resy and Eater. And his Slow Hunch is several decades old, very interesting, twisty, but also extremely consistent along the journey of helping people enjoy dining and dining become a better business for restaurateurs. Through generations of media and technology. Really interesting story and great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it.
So maybe you could introduce yourself and say what is the Slow Hunch you've been pursuing?
So I'm Ben Leventhal. I have been in and around restaurants for more than 20 years. I'm lucky enough to have never operated a restaurant, but I've built companies that are partners of restaurants, Eater, Resy, and now Blackbird. And I would say my slow hunch comes down to the idea that restaurants are not operating as well as they could be. I think generally my slow hunch in life is that the status quo is always wrong. And as it relates to restaurants, that means that the business model that 99.9% of restaurants use is broken. And I've always believed that. And the problem with the status quo is that most people ascribe to it. And so I think that's sort of the through line that you could point to.
So what would be an example of the restaurant business model being broken?
Well, what we know about restaurants is it's a huge industry. It's $1 trillion in the United States.
Wow.
There's thousands and thousands and thousands of restaurants, and people love restaurants. And only the intensity of love that consumers have for their favorite restaurants has only grown over time. 20 years ago, it was about celebrity chefs, and we were in the age of the chef, and every restaurant had a chef, and you knew the chef's name, and that chef had a cult of personality around them. Now we're, I think, in the age of branded restaurants. And it's slightly different because you don't go into the restaurant necessarily knowing the name of the chef, but you do know the brand.
Yep.
But throughout, people have just gotten closer and closer and closer to restaurants. And they've spent more and more of their disposable income on restaurants. And in fact, you could look at big cities, I think, New York, LA, San Francisco, and you could see that in those cities, categories like clubs, other forms of nightlife, have lost market share to restaurants.
Interesting.
And so it's a huge industry. It's made up of these tiny little players. None of them are making any money.
Hard business.
It's a hard business, but that's my slow hunch is it doesn't have to be that hard.
I love it.
And when you go into a restaurant and you talk to an operator, there is a sort of garden variety lament. It's a really tough business. The labor market's impossible. Food costs are going up. I don't know what I'm going to do. And that just can't possibly be the right answer. We, as consumers, are too willing to support restaurants that we love for restaurants to then turn around and report zero profits.
And be
it
struggling.
doesn't make any sense.
Got it. Right. So it's a mismatch.
It's a mismatch.
People love them and they're struggling.
That's right.
It's a hard business also.
It's definitely a hard business. My Slow Hunch is not that it's an easy business, but it doesn't have to be a hard and broken business.
There we go.
It can be a hard but solid business.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's look back, and I mean way back. So obviously you have a 25 or so year career in this industry, but even looking like way back before that, like why do you care about this? Like when was the moment where something clicked for you that this was interesting to you?
I mean, I think like many people, I just always have loved restaurants. Like some of the earliest memories of my life I have are at restaurants, sitting around a table with my family. When I was 5 years old, I had all kinds of silly special orders. Like in the Chinese restaurant, all I wanted was white rice and, the broth with just rice in it, no chicken, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But the table in a restaurant has always been a happy place for me. I think that's the case with many people. I think somehow I've just figured out how to turn that into a career. But I've always sort of felt like one thing is I really enjoy getting to know the restaurant. Like I really find like that process of going from an outsider in a restaurant to being an insider.
Yeah.
There is something about that is just intoxicating. Like when you finally get the sort of nod from the maitre d' or the owner, it is something that you remember.
Yep.
And so that's always sort of been like an elixir for me. And
amazing.
I think that plus just the natural love of restaurants has somehow kept me anchored to this industry.
And we'll get to Blackbird, but I think one of the things that's so interesting about Blackbird is like a version of productizing that journey from being an outsider to an insider, and you can feel it. You know, and you're that vibe that obviously is decades old in you is like apparent in the product today, which is really cool. Okay, 5 years old, white rice, broth, get the nod from maitre d'. Like as you were kind of getting older and getting out in the world, like when did you know that it was something more than just an interest and something that maybe you wanted to pursue professionally? Did you study it in college or was it later?
I didn't study it. I went to college and studied finance and economics. And even when I graduated, I went to work at MTV Networks in video production and video content development. But restaurants were always sort of a side project. There was always a side hustle there. I was the guy who people went to for recommendations, of course. The earliest signal that maybe there was something here for me from a career standpoint is when I was at MTV. We were sitting in a cube. There was 3 other people. I was the only native New Yorker, and everyone was young. Everyone was 22 years old and discovering New York for the first time. And I sort of became their tour guide.
Ah, nice.
And I developed it into this very niche, quirky site called She Loves New York, which was a really cryptic early Substack. Actually, I mean, it was a weekly email newsletter. Before there was Substack, there were blogs. Before there were blogs, there were email newsletters. So I guess it's all this was an email newsletter in the age of Daily Candy and things like that.
I was never a subscriber to that, but I remember Flavor Pill back in the day was a version of that that was like bringing you New York culture, one email at a time.
That's right. So when I was doing She Loves New York, Flavor Pill was one of the sites that I would often go to see what was going on.
Ah, nice.
And it was Flavor Pill, and it was when Gothamist was getting started.
Sure. Yep.
And it was when my Eater co-founder Lockhart Steele had a website called Below 14th Street, which was all about what was going on below 14th Street. So I would kind of cobble all these things together, and I had this newsletter called She Loves New York, and people responded to it. Whenever you're building something, especially I think in content, the easiest way to figure out if you're doing it right or wrong is if you can get people to react.
Yeah.
It's easy for people not to care.
Sure.
But if you can get people to react either positively or negatively, I think it's a really strong signal you're onto something. And so I started doing this and people just reacted. Some people were like, what is this? Like, what? I have no idea what you're talking about. But a lot of people sort of saw it. It was so cryptic. It was just like a mist. It was like a coded, mysterious, really like honestly just collection of words. And people sort of saw it as a game. They tried to figure it out.
Break that down a little bit. What was so cryptic about it?
I tethered it to restaurants of the moment and pop culture ideas of the moment. The header would be Material Girl, and it'd be 4 places that Madonna was spotted in that week.
Got it. Yeah, that's good.
And
it's a scavenger hunt.
It's a scavenger hunt.
Right.
And then at the end of it, the last category was always Resy, something called Resy. And this is early. This is like, and this is before even OpenTable was like the default. I would call the restaurant and I would ask them for a table, and the Resy was just the transcription of what they would say.
Like what?
So the Resy would be 5:30 or 10. We can seat you at 5:30 or 10.
I gotcha. And you'd broadcast that out.
That's right.
What's the Resy on this
What
restaurant?
is the Resy? 5:30 or 10.
Yeah, okay.
And in some restaurants like press 1, hold, press 2, 5:30 or 10.
Right. You save people a couple steps.
Right. Yeah. So that started to click, and I found myself, and this is, I think, a rule of entrepreneurship. Like when you find yourself spending more time on something, you sometimes just want to kind of follow that thread.
And this was just a side project, just like a little,
But it led to other things. My readers were writers at places like New York Magazine and Daily Candy, and it led to opportunities there. And it led to me meeting my co-founder on Eater. But that was how it started. I mean,
it was a really fun time in New York. I remember that era, and like it was a really good time for local media in New York.
Oh,
right. There was just
the best time.
It was easier to break through. We didn't have really Twitter and Facebook and TikTok in the same way, and so it was a good timing, I guess, to come up with indie media that was very New York centric and authentic.
The timing was incredible, and that was it was a golden age of content in New York, because you had established media that had been doing the same thing for decades, and then all of a sudden, thanks to a bunch of new digital content tools, anyone could have a voice.
And those new moves hadn't been like productized into platforms yet. So there was just really nice
That's right.
You could and people weren't saturated with it for their attention the way they are today.
That's right.
And so how did you meet Lockhart, and how did She Loves New York turn into Eater?
Well,
if it did.
So it certainly, there's DNA in She Loves New York that you can see in Eater.
Okay.
And if you really look at it, Eater is a combination of the DNA of She Loves New York and of Below 14th Street.
Got it.
I see. If you want to go and do the archaeological exploration, those are the two source materials. And we met through a mutual friend, who Pavio Rosati was, and she was the managing editor of Daily Candy. And she was a reader of both our things and a friend to both of us. And she sort of said, you guys really need to connect. Obviously, I knew who he was because he had this blog that
you were reading already.
And he was a reader of She Loves New York.
Yep.
And he was also the managing editor of Gawker at the time. And so he had some of the know-how that I didn't have in terms of standing it up. And, we met, and we were sort of friends and sort of informal collaborators for a while, and then
do you remember the moment when you decided to work together?
I remember we were sitting at a bar on Sullivan or Thompson Street. I don't think it's there anymore, but one thing that motivates me is I want to do things that are of interest and that I can't stop thinking about, but also I want to do things to prevent other people from doing them. I don't ever want to wake up and look at something and say, I should have done that.
I had that idea 6 weeks ago and I should have done it. Right. Or even I didn't have the idea, but I wish I had.
I wish I had thought of that. Those are okay. I wish I had thought of it are okay. But the ones where I know for sure something would work
100%.
and I don't do them, those keep me up at night. So we had Gawker and we had Gothamist and we had all these things, and I had She Loves New York as a backdrop, and I really loved the blogging. Early blogging was so much fun as a format. And so we were at this bar and I just said, we should do this. We love restaurants in the same way. We got to do this. And we're going to call it Eater, and here's what it's going to be.
So let's talk about Eater and what that started out as and what it became and how it was part of, this hunch and this journey of your idea.
So Eater was really sports play-by-play applied to restaurants. The chefs, the owners, even sometimes the customers of restaurants, these were our athletes. And when you love a sports team, you have an insatiable appetite for content about that team. And so similarly, we sort of looked at the restaurant industry this way.
Amazing.
And it's just how we wanted to think about it. We weren't really trying to reverse engineer anything. We weren't trying to necessarily appeal to a certain kind of person. We were just sort of writing in a way where we were following our own passions. And, but I mean, as it relates to the hunch, I do think this is part of thinking about restaurants differently. Like restaurants have we have a very traditional sense of what the restaurant is. And it's, you come in, you sit down, there's a menu, there's a format, you have to adhere to that format. You have this meal, you get up and you leave, and then at some point you do that again and over and over. And at that point, it was the chef, and the chef gets a review, and then when the chef is super successful, maybe the chef gets a TV show, and the magazines publish the chef's recipes, and we go and on and on.
And that was sort of like the media journey of a restaurant,
right?
In trad media, basically, TV, magazines,
exactly.
And even with that, there's still a fair bit of distance, right? You don't feel as connected. You feel somewhat connected, but not as connected as you
100%.
could with
There's
new
no
media.
intimacy to it.
Right.
And so our hunch was that people cared about restaurants in a slightly different way.
Yep.
And they cared about the physical space of the restaurant and the idea of the restaurant and how a restaurant made you feel.
Yep.
And so that's sort of how we got Eater going.
If you think about your journey and your hunch as sort of a two-sided thing, right? Of like how to help restaurant operators do better at the business and also how to increase the enjoyment, on the other side. How, in the Eater part of the journey, how do you feel like the restaurants responded to it? How engaged with them were you? Did they like it? Was it weird? Did they welcome it?
They initially hated it. They initially hated it because it was so unfamiliar to them.
Right.
It was a process of them losing control.
Yep.
Some of the early conversations that stick out in my mind were with restaurateurs who didn't understand why we weren't playing by the rules.
The rules being?
The rules being, when you open a restaurant, you sort of get to pick who writes about it.
I see.
And nobody writes about it until you're ready for them to.
Yep.
And that's just how it goes. And sometimes you hire a publicist, and that publicist sends out a press release. And your job as a journalist is to read that press release and regurgitate it. And when there was an embargo, to respect the embargo. And we just didn't do any of that. We walked by a piece of plywood on West 10th Street, and we would be like, "Oh, that looks like it's going to be a restaurant," and we'd peer our heads in, and sure enough, there was a beautiful mahogany bar being built, and we'd ask the construction guys, like, "What's going on here?"
And then you'd write about it.
And then somebody would say, "Oh, that's Keith McNally's new restaurant."
Yep.
And then we'd say, with like a screamer headline, "Breaking: Keith McNally settling on West 10th Street. Timeline unknown."
Yeah.
And people went nuts.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I mean, I actually, Keith, Keith was actually, it's in some ways an early fan of ours, but old school guys, it took them a long time to get comfortable with it. And
I'm sure.
And that was people just hated it.
And did that change over time? Because, the internet was new, blogging was new, there was an adjustment period. And
it did change. Yeah. I mean, some of that was broader than Eater. Some of that was just, as you said, the media landscape shifting and changing and evolving. Some of that was us pushing, certainly in the restaurant category. I mean, and, once we started, we had this really quirky advantage on day zero, which is that we were not subject to the standard schedule of the New York Times publishing.
Yep. Okay.
The New York Times, which used to be the voice of truth, the ultimate authority on food, they published every Wednesday. And it was in print. And sometimes some of that stuff showed up on the website. But Wednesday was the day where food news broke.
Got it.
So we had the whole rest of the week
to get people's attention, and maybe even to scoop
we scooped
the New York Times.
We scooped every single thing they put on this. We scooped them to the point where it was comical. And Florence Fabricant, who is a legend and is the editor of essentially the news of restaurants for the New York Times, was just livid. And not just with us, with everyone.
I'm sure.
She started threatening operators. Don't give that to Eater. This has to be I want this as an exclusive. Right. But it was too easy. So they obviously all the schedules eventually changed and it all became pretty much real time. But
what's interesting about that to me is like and what I like about kind of all slow hunches really is that they're contextual. The what's possible changes at every moment in time. And it's this idea in Stephen Johnson's book called the adjacent possible. So like you're at a moment like that with the technology at hand, like what can you do that's new and different? And, obviously that changes every, couple years. And like this is a story about sort of trad media, print media to like internet 1.0 essentially. And then if I think ahead to your whole, the rest of your story, which we'll walk through, Resy is more about web 2.0 and like maybe mobile, and like the transactional web. Eater's about the content web, Resy's maybe about the transactional web, and Blackbird is kind of about like the crypto web. And you've done a pretty awesome job of like opening a door at each stage of the story with the technology at hand and like doing something like different that wasn't possible before each stage. Like that's kind of awesome.
I just think that I always look at everything and I say there's gotta be a better way. You have to understand, it's not always a good thing. I get into a taxi and the driver takes Fifth Avenue, and instinctively I think they should be taking Lex.
Because now they're following the GPS, and in the old days they'd be using their
There's got to be a better way. It doesn't always work out, but I think in my career, the moments that I've been successful, they have been about being insistent that there's a better way.
And that there's a new thing that can enable that better way.
That's right.
I guess.
That's right. You always have to look at the tools of the moment, right? You always have to look at everything that's out there as your building materials, as your context.
Yep.
Because that's not what traditional companies do well. Big legacy companies love the status quo. Nobody is happier with the status quo than the CEO of a large corporation, because big companies get to control the status quo.
Yep.
Right.
And they have a whole business model built around it, and they have shareholders, expecting it, and trajectories that they need to hit, and there's a lot of reasons why that happens.
Earnings per share, quarterly calls, great news, status quo, full steam ahead. And they use small companies obviously as R&D and as ways to grow. But but as an entrepreneur, as a small company, you have to look at the raw materials available to you and figure out what you can do.
Ideally, do something very different that wasn't possible before.
Right, because the only advantage you have is that.
Right.
You don't have the advantage of scale. You don't have the advantage of data or intelligence or historical learnings, really. You just have...
Or distribution, I guess, which is related to scale.
Right. All you have is agility and raw material.
New moves and speed. Let's maybe go through Eater, and then how long was the Eater journey? What happened at the end?
The Eater journey was... it was close to 10 years.
Wow.
I was only there for the first 5 or so. And then we sold it to Vox Media in 2013.
Which kind of makes sense, right? Because it was the early days of blogging, and then sort of a later consolidation of blogging into larger media platforms.
Yep.
So where did you go after Eater?
So after Eater, I did a bunch of stuff. I worked on a project called Kitchen Surfing.
Mm-hmm. I remember.
USV portfolio company, actually.
Yeah, indeed, yes.
And the idea there was that if you needed a chef, you should be able to open an app and get one for an hour or for a day or however long you needed one. It didn't really work very well, although a lot of people believe in that idea.
The idea is still alive.
It's still alive.
Yes.
Somebody will crack the code someday, maybe. I worked on that. I worked on some projects and some various things for IAC and NBC and Food Network. And I did a project for NBC to help them create new lifestyle content for their local platform. And then at the tail end of 2014, Gary Vee, who I had met many, many years prior when I was doing Eater, and he was still a wine blogger. We sat down for a couple meals that year and got around to what would become Resy.
And that timing is interesting in terms of the adjacent possible and the tools at hand. So what was available then? What sparked a line of thinking that ultimately led to Resy?
100%. Restaurants had not gone mobile.
Right.
Just fundamentally had not gone mobile. And we obviously ran with that. I mean, some of the early stuff was just text to confirm your reservation.
Right.
I mean,
at best.
Dumb stuff.
Right.
Dumb ideas, but it just hadn't gone mobile. And we had OpenTable, we had Yelp, we had City Search, we had these large companies with very large databases of restaurants, sort of like kind of big monolithic search and discovery and booking.
Right, and these were all sort of desktop web originating
desktop web first, for sure.
Companies, right? Native.
And even when you looked at their maps, they weren't mobile first mapping.
Yep.
So, we just sort of said, well, that's interesting. Restaurants haven't gone mobile. Uber was a huge data signal at that point for us.
Right, and Uber launched in maybe 2011 or something like that. So it, at that point, was at some scale and showing the way for what can be done on a phone in a city.
Exactly. And so what we observed is, well, people are opening their app and getting something in real time. And that was super, we didn't actually ultimately get to that with Resy. And nobody has quite cracked the code on that true real-time delivery of access to restaurants. It's, we have ideas, and I may or may not ever crack the code on it, but I'm still working on it.
I love it.
But we never got to that, which is to say, I'm hungry and I want to go to a restaurant somewhere around me right this second.
Yep.
You can go to a restaurant right around the corner if they have a table, but the sort of idea that there is a market for access and real-time inventory, we haven't gotten there yet. But we saw Uber, and we generally noted, people, this is Instagram, this is Uber, people are on their phones. Like the primary surface has become mobile, and for restaurants, they weren't there yet.
And there, at that time though, there was digital booking, right? Like OpenTable was in business. I don't know when they started, but
late 90s.
Got it. Oh, okay. Got it. And so they already had some pretty good distribution into the restaurant industry. Obviously, people knew about it.
Huge.
So what's interesting about that is you're thinking about launching Resy as a competitor, basically. There's already sort of a new age incumbent in the case, newish age incumbent in the case of OpenTable. How did you use mobile or whatever was new at that moment to find a lane?
Something that's a little bit flawed in the way I think about things is it didn't occur to me that OpenTable was our competitor.
Okay.
And to be totally honest with you, when we started Eater, it didn't occur to me that the New York Times was our competitor.
Fascinating.
And people kept saying, oh, you guys are taking on OpenTable. And I kept saying, no, we're not. What are you talking about? And then at some point we woke up and we said, oh, wait a second.
Who did you think you were competing with?
We thought we were competing in white space.
Interesting.
Yeah, we thought that that maybe this might be something that Uber tried, but we thought that this was something net new.
Because of the mobile first
Because
experience.
It was mobile first. Because the initial idea of Resy, not only was it mobile first, but it was also pay for play. and that there was nothing there in that space at the time. It was pay $25 for a table at Charlie Bird.
Got it.
So
That was
where Resy
different.
started.
Yes, that was different.
And
skip the line, I guess?
it skipped the line,
Yeah, okay.
last minute tables.
Right. Sounds familiar.
But that's where it all started. So we
see.
didn't think it resembled OpenTable. We looked at OpenTable and we said, look, you can't select where you're seating in OpenTable. Like we launched Resy in the summer of 2014. And the wonderful thing about launching in the summer in a place like New York City is inside and outside.
I love it.
And the outside tables are only available in good weather. So restaurants don't have that inventory until they do.
Amazing.
And it's always last minute. And so that's
Fascinating.
That's what we launched with.
And if you had launched in the winter, it might have been harder.
It definitely would have been harder.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So we went to the restaurants. We said, well, what about the outside tables?
Can you give us the outside tables? Right. So that was the wedge.
That was the wedge.
Outside tables, pay for priority on mobile for outside tables.
Yeah. So we had the pay for priority, and then we also had this feature called Notify, which is now industry standard, but we've created Notify, which is just when you want a table, instead of having to book it, if it's not available, you click notify me if it becomes available.
Yep.
Now this is standard everywhere now.
Of course. Yep.
But we introduced this for restaurants, and so this was a very, very nice combination with last minute outside seating.
Bingo. Yes.
Because you'd have a restaurant at that time. It was Charlie Bird, and Upside was brand new at that time. Upland was brand new, and there was 1,000 people waiting for tables, and so we would put 2 or 3 outside tables available same day, and they'd book in 2 seconds.
And it's interesting, again, to think about this from both perspectives of the restaurant side and the diner side. Obviously, diners like that because it's access to inventory and notifications and convenience that they might not have otherwise. Was it the same story on the restaurant side where for this initial go-to-market wedge, they were like, cool, but like free bonus, no beef? Or was there convincing or other concerns?
There was some convincing. I mean, again, restaurants, to tie this back to the Slow Hunch, like restaurants love the stat. Restaurants believe in the status quo.
The whole idea of a restaurant is you open it, you start it, and you keep running it for 50 or 100 years if you're lucky.
Restaurateurs believe that the right idea is the status quo.
I get that. And by the way, as a consumer of restaurants, I love the idea of going back to a place that I went to when I was 12 and now I'm 46 and I ordered the dish that I had when I was 12 and it tastes the same way it did when I was 12.
That's exactly right. Now, this maybe in part 2, this is a whole other conversation, but the real trick is actually to evolve them. Because when restaurants get to like 5 years old and 10 years old and then 20 years old and 30 years old, there are only 2 kinds of those restaurants. Like as they get older, they're the ones that somehow find a way to become timeless.
Yep.
And the ones that become irrelevant.
Yes.
And those are just, those eventually just die. They're just on a long, slow bleed out path. But the ones that figure out just enough evolution to be timeless survive forever. Like a Raoul's in Soho or an Il Cantinori down the street. Those restaurants might be there forever because they're doing somehow, some way, they actually they're just slightly ahead of the status quo.
And how do you think, so that makes sense to me, and there's a lot of dimensions to that, right? There's sort of menu is probably the most important, maybe the most important one?
I don't know if it's menu.
Okay.
I think it might be, it might actually be the staff. Staff might be part of it. I don't know the answer. Raoul's is second generation now in terms of the owner. It's the same family, second generation, and it feels super young in there.
Got it.
And so I think like staff is part of it, right? And I think sort of this like a restaurant has to sort of have a youthful thing about it, even when it's been there forever. Yep. And I think that's part of it. It's not the whole thing, but because you can also look at, there's lots of restaurants where the food actually hasn't evolved and nobody really cares. Like, at Raoul's, the food's the same food. They added a burger 10 years ago. You can get like 6 of them at 5 o'clock or whatever it is.
By the way, you have in-depth knowledge of many menus across many restaurants in the United States, in New York City, deeply embedded in your brain.
it's there, whether for better or for worse.
Well, and then the sort of surface area, let's call it, that technology provides is a part of that, right?
Yeah.
And evolving with the times and, point of sale stuff and mobile, bookings and all these other things. And, so that's a piece of that. So there has to be at least some openness to evolution.
Right. But when we went in with Resy and we said, well, will you just give us the outside tables? A lot of restaurants said no.
How come?
Because they are afraid of change. Because again, the status quo is what most restaurateurs perceive to be the path of survival. So a lot of places said no. And just how you could map the consumer audience to sort of where they are on the adoption curve of new technology, you can do that with restaurants too. So there are restaurants that are out there that are on the bleeding edge, and there are operators that think that far ahead. And then there's guys that are the last of the game. And that's and wherever they are, I've done this enough now to know who's going to be out on the bleeding edge and who's going to be last to the game. And I think you can certainly be more efficient in your sales process if you know that. But when we were starting Resy, most of them said no.
Was there some common pattern in the folks who said yes?
The yeses were by and large downtown, which you might expect, and they were younger operators, which you also might expect. And a couple of times, and this was the case at Upland, we kind of snuck in because what we did was we went to a maitre d' or a front of house person and made their life easier. And the woman who helped us at Upland is this woman, her name is Corey Arnold, who actually works at Blackbird now.
Nice.
And I've known her now obviously for a long time. And she sort of snuck us into Upland. She understood what Resy was. It was her responsibility to fill the tables.
Got it. So she wanted help. So if she thought you could help, she's like, I'll take it.
She looked at this Notify thing and she's like, oh yeah, I get this. Like, great.
And you, I guess, had a way of making it easy or possible or easy for someone who wasn't in charge of like central decision making, let's say, to adopt?
Yes, we did that by accident.
Okay.
We did that. That wasn't intentional, but the way we built the software, it made it pretty easy. And when we went to Corey and when we sort of started having these discussions at different restaurants, we discovered that sometimes that could happen.
Right, where you could ask the host or the maitre d' to like, hey, just download our app and just punch in some stuff, some openings, and we'll try to fill them. And it doesn't have to be like central IT.
Right. So it's sort of like, just say yes.
And we'll figure it out.
You got it.
And how long was the Resy journey?
The Resy journey was actually quick. I mean, it certainly in VC time, it was only 5 years.
Yep, that is past.
So we founded Resy in 2014. We sold it to Amex in 2019, in July of 2019. And obviously now Resy is an integral part of Amex. We sold it at a moment where, in hindsight, it was 6 months before the pandemic. So better to be lucky than good. Incredible timing.
Holy cow.
Although there's a couple of other contemporaries of Resy's in terms of restaurant tech startups. They found a way to the other side, and they got good exits too. But
there was obviously a mass, just catastrophic boom to the
existential struggle in 2020 and 2021. But yeah, we sold it in 2019. I sold it because I just felt like, Resy's a grindy business. A lot of the things that we did to be successful in terms of bringing it to market were also things that did hurt us from a business model standpoint.
Like what?
Well, we didn't charge per seat. Mm-hmm. OpenTable's model, and the reason OpenTable historically had such a high valuation on it is because they made $20,000 or $30,000 per restaurant per year, charging $1 per cover.
Right.
That's an awesome business for OpenTable. It's a real problem for the restaurant, and that's the opportunity we saw.
Got it.
And so we went to restaurants and said, well, you're not going to pay us per cover, just pay us $3.99 a month. And so that helped us get to market.
Right, but it had to put a ceiling
put
on
a ceiling
Yeah.
on what the business looked like when it came to investors and when it came to ultimately like sizing. So it was really hard to raise money for Resy, and we did it through mostly strategics, no serious, some seed investors, some seed institutional investors came in, but no serious VCs were really at the table. And that was just because as nice as the idea is, as cool as the Resy story is, and as much as it makes sense to go out and take down the incumbent, all things that happened and we did, it just wasn't that big a business.
Got it at the end. Yeah. Sometimes it happens that way.
Do the math on $4,000 a year in terms of $4,000
per customer.
Per customer. You need a lot of restaurants.
Yep.
And you also it's a rip and replace piece of software, meaning in order for Resy to be in there, OpenTable or something else has to be removed. So you have to rip and replace it. So, you only can a really good account executive with that kind of sell, that's like 8 to 10 deals a year, 8 to 12 deals a year. I remember I had a conversation with, in 2016, 2017, when Resy was starting to get its footing and the rest of the industry was starting to take note, I met with OpenTable. And I said to OpenTable, here's the price. And it was very, very high. I said, if you don't take this now, we're gonna take you down.
Wow.
And I don't know if I said that exact thing to them, but
that's a great way to remember it. I'm sure that's exactly how it
but
went.
I remember one of the things that somebody there said, and they were absolutely right, is look, you may be right about everything that you're doing, but you're never going to get your account executives to be more productive than 12 deals a month.
Right. And
I said to them at the time, I said, you're wrong, we're going to get to 20. Never got to 20. In this category, a great AE, a bag carrying AE is closing 10 to 12 deals a month. So do that math.
Right. And they need to see upside, and they're grinding and we're doing a really, really hard thing. And then the win that you get from that is just not big enough. So the sort of pace times it's really hard. The reward.
It's really, really hard. And so we looked at that, and I looked at the team, and we just sort of said, like, this is really kind of where we want this business to land anyway. And
what made Amex a good buyer?
Well, it was great brand alignment. Just great brand alignment. Really good sensibility alignment in terms of, what does Resy sort of stand for restaurants? How does Amex exist in the ecosystem? What does that brand, how does that live in restaurants? There was tons of brand alignment. There was one huge difference between Amex and Resy. Amex is card member first.
Yep.
Amex's whole business is in the service of the card member.
Yep.
And merchants come second.
Yep. Okay.
And that has always been the case, and that is fundamental to their business. And Resy was the opposite. Resy has always been restaurant first. And the reason is because I so deeply believe that you got to be a champion of restaurants.
Right. Because of where we started.
Exactly.
It's something everybody wants and everybody loves, but it's too hard.
That's right.
So they're the ones that need the help.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that was the fundamental. That was the only thing that was different. And I sat down with the EVP of consumer who had to bless the deal. And it was like the last meeting, and he asked me this question, like, is Resy fundamentally customer first or restaurant first?
Wow.
And I said, we're restaurant first, but the reason is, and the reason this matters for Amex is because if you want all of the things that you need for card members, if you want the access, if you want the hospitality, you need to have restaurants on your side.
Yep.
And that's true. And they're still using that
and this helps with that.
That's right.
It's like, would you rather be loved or feared? I just watched A Bronx Tale last week with my son. All right, so that was the end of the Resy chapter. Also, talk about like a moment in time when the world changed, right? COVID, everybody's inside, all
whole
that
world
stuff,
everywhere.
Everything blown up. You took some time off.
Yeah.
Also, I imagine, so like, let's think about all the things that were changing in 2020, 2021, 2022. COVID is obviously an enormous one. And then at the same time, there was like a whole nother kind of enabling tech revolution that was brewing. I had been brewing for some time, but was brewing in a kind of an interesting way then, which was crypto and blockchain stuff. How did that get into your head? What did that make you think might be possible? And how did that lead to what ultimately became Blackbird?
I was at Amex through the end of 2020.
Okay.
And obviously, the second the pandemic settled into place, everything in the world changed. Everyone got rewired. And the thing that didn't change is that people were still really passionate about restaurants.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like you could walk into the restaurant and have dinner, but you could order their sauce or their pasta or their meal kit or their swag. Or
oh my God. Wow.
Or their Mad Libs. Restaurant in LA, Spare Room, wrote their own Mad Libs and people bought them.
But
and
I just want to pause on that for a second because that is such a profound insight. Like as the easiest way to think about COVID was that it just, kneecapped all the restaurants. But you're right that the thing it did is it kind of forced them to try a whole bunch of new things, to keep engagement, to keep their businesses, the lights on. And there's all these new moves that kind of came out of that were, a lot of them were really great. Yeah.
They were awesome moves. And for a brief second, I felt really like invigorated and to some extent vindicated because I was like, see, like, look at all these other things you can sell.
Well, it's a little bit like the beginning, it's like the newsletter, She Lives in New York or Eater, where it's like, these people want connections in different ways.
Yeah.
And you're not always thinking about offering them or even dreaming them up if you're just focused on making the status quo work. So you kind of have to be shaken up from it a little bit to see those.
Lilia started doing meal kits and Carbone started doing meal kits and just whatever neighborhood restaurants started doing meal kits and everyone was so excited to get the meal kits.
Yeah.
And these meal kits weren't that good, but they were like our connection to the restaurant.
Yep.
And it was a really, in that very limited way, exciting to see that. The broader context, obviously, is that they're not making tons of money on this stuff.
Right.
This is not a sustainable future. But it was this like really important signal that these restaurant brands are more than we think they are.
Yep.
And
interesting.
Some of these restaurant brands play like lifestyle brands, which is sort of something I was, the Eater being about the play-by-play of restaurants, Resy pay for play, new things. A lot of that's sort of like about how restaurants are entertainment.
Yep.
How if you think about restaurants, the contours of an entertainment company, of an entertainment brand, or an artist or an entertainer, the contours are a little bit different. And so that's part of this, is that restaurants sort of became entertainers in that way and started doing other things. Also, chefs were doing Zoom demos and, Amex produced some of this stuff. You got a meal kit and a cookbook and an appointment to show up on a Zoom call and the chef walked you through the thing.
Question, how did all that coincide with TikTok and Reels? And because like that also opened up like a window into restaurants that I think is very powerful. I can't remember exactly when that was, but it was more or less around.
It came a little later. I think it came a little bit later.
Okay.
I think that's more like the second half of 21 into 22 maybe, and you sort of start to get these restaurants that have this like TikTok cult thing going on, and there's crowded restaurants, and you, as like I'll call it, as an old timer, like you kind of can't figure out why they're crowded, and it turns out it's because somebody made them huge on TikTok.
Yep.
I think that came a little bit later, but not by much.
Yep.
But so I guess I was generally seeing the evolution of restaurants. I was still at Amex in early COVID, and as I left Amex, my thinking was around, first, I didn't really know what was next, and I didn't have any systematic way to hunt that down, but things started popping into my head. Mm-hmm. My process is things start popping into my head, and then I try to talk to smart people. Mm-hmm. And so restaurants as brand was popping into my head. Crypto was in my head because this is now NFTs.
Yep.
NFT projects becoming these like crazy
cult brand,
big money, big brand
Yep.
things.
Yep.
Bitcoin, digital currency, permissionless systems, networks. There was a couple of things that touched the restaurant industry that were notable. Gary Vee did this thing called Fly Fish Club.
Yep.
And he raised a ton of money that was essentially for a theoretical project, which 4 years later came to 4 years later came to fruition. But these were the ideas that were sort of like in my head. And then I actually went to Fred, and because I've known Fred and we've been friends for 20 years. We initially met when Joanne and Fred were angel investors in Eater. And I went to Fred and I said, I think there's a digital restaurant currency thing we should do. It's kind of all I said. I think I kind of said something like that. Yeah, you.
Well, I was there, and I heard a couple days later, Ben Leventhal has an idea for something to do with digital assets and restaurants, and like we should probably back it. And so we did.
But all it was I had all people who are now involved in this business, Mo Koifman and Fred and Jeremy Phillips, who are all dear friends of mine and some of the smartest people I know, and all people I talk to about ideas when I need to tease them out of my own brain.
Yep.
So we happened to be sitting in the same place, and I sort of just raised this idea, I think there's probably a currency for restaurants somewhere. And that was the initial kernel of this. And Fred was immediately like the way he does.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, let's go.
Let's go. Yeah.
And he helped me write this sort of initial white paper. I think if you look at the history of that document, like you may even see that he created the doc. And it was called Dinecoin, obviously at the moment.
I remember that.
And it sort of, we teased it out from there. And it really was about the size, again, humongous industry, tiny players. Is there something we can do with crypto to change things? Is there something we can do to sort of shift some of the rules here and give the small restaurants some tools and some leverage that they didn't otherwise have? And so we kind of built it out from there.
So anybody who's listening to this, probably familiar with Resy and OpenTable, maybe familiar with Eater, may not be familiar with Blackbird. So what is Blackbird in a nutshell today? Blackbird
is a loyalty and payments platform, and the currency that you use on Blackbird is called Fly. And Fly in the future will be the global currency for all restaurants.
Let's go. I went out to dinner around the corner from here in Greenwich Village last night, and I paid for my dinner with Fly.
There you
go. It was great. I checked in at the restaurant. I tapped on the puck. When we were done eating, the check showed up on my phone. I hit a button. I paid with Fly, and I earned some Fly. And so what is it about a global currency for restaurants that's attractive to consumers or to restaurateurs?
So we have fiat currency, and we have digital currency, and we have digital stable currency.
Yep.
And I think there's another category that's developing, and that's platform currency. And the difference between a digital stable currency and a platform currency is that platform currency, it can do other things. It can be about access. You can look at the velocity of spend in the context of restaurants, and that can be an unlock. You can look at your balance, and that can be an unlock. By the way, good or bad, you might want the high or low balance, and that might be a signal.
And just to clarify, like a stable currency is something like a USDC, a US dollar coin, that it's just a dollar is a dollar anywhere on crypto and eventually anywhere on the internet. Whereas a Fly is a dollar of buying power, but it's also all these other things.
That's right.
Within the network.
That's right. Your balance of Fly could be a passport, right? It could create access opportunities for you. The amount of Fly that you've spent or that you've held or that you have given to a specific restaurant could matter in other ways beyond just it being money. And so that's the thing. So it'll be global. The benefits of a digital currency being cross-border will apply. But again, like there's some restaurants as its own specific industry with its own specific nuances and dynamics will have its own currency.
And so I think one's imagination can pretty quickly start to unpack why on the consumer side this might be interesting. It's reminiscent of loyalty points. It's sort of like, or maybe other digital assets where you kind of gain benefits from, participating. Might be harder for people to understand why such a system is better for the restaurateurs. How do they view it? And then maybe also let's talk about what's it been like to explain it to them and sell it to them.
I think the two easiest ways to understand this are, one is anytime restaurants are transacting in USD, they're losing money by getting it in and out of the system. The legacy players in money are taking a vig.
How much?
It's usually 3 or 4%.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Remember, these restaurants, their profit
On every
margins,
transaction.
their profit margins are 3 or 4%. So if 3 or 4% is coming out on top on every transaction, that's insane. Again, this is somebody who's sitting at the table and has eaten your food. I don't understand why you need to spend 4% to get the money from them.
Right. I don't think people realize that's. I don't think most people realize that's happening.
For sure.
Right.
If they gave you cash, you'd keep 100% of it.
Unbelievable.
Right. So that's number one. So there's a ton of value to be recaptured by not having to come in and out of the legacy system every time somebody walks through your door. The other is that
only hold that thought versus if I load up Fly onto my Blackbird account, which I've done. I can start transacting and they can start receiving, and we can have 1,000 transactions with like almost no
that's right
take on all those.
Exactly.
Right.
The other big thing is by having a currency that's specific to the industry, on a industry level basis, the value stays in the industry.
Interesting.
There's two leakages that we're sort of trying to solve for. One is at the individual restaurant level, all the money that's flowing out as a matter of transaction costs. Two is the value that's flowing out to other industries, right? If you want to offer, this is a discount context, right? Tuesday nights, 10% off, or Tuesday nights, happy hour, okay? If it's 20% off, the 20% is going somewhere else. It's not staying in the industry.
Right. I save 20% on a happy hour. Let's call it $100. That $20, I'm going to go buy a slice of pizza with it or do something else. Right, exactly. Versus you give me a discount in Fly, I still have that balance sitting there. I may not spend it at your restaurant tomorrow, but I'm going to spend it at a restaurant.
It's staying in the industry.
Right.
And I think in the long run, there's incredible benefits to that dynamic.
I believe there's also something about the way Blackbird and Fly are designed such that the restaurants have a more direct relationship with the consumer, the diner. And that's correct, right? And how important is that, and what does that look like?
I think it's super important. I mean, I think, so we are going to, by the end of 2025, on the Blackbird platform, publish 2 APIs to make available for third parties. One is that anyone can accept Fly.
Okay.
As a merchant, you can use the API to accept Fly, which means that you don't have to necessarily be using Blackbird's software.
Got it.
To be
a Fly. You can connect
merchant.
it to your other payment systems.
And the other is we want to publish an identity API, which gives consumers essentially direct rails to turn over their information to restaurants.
If they want to.
So of course it's opt-in.
Yep.
But that's the other piece here, which is that restaurants and consumers, and this may apply to merchants beyond restaurants at some point, but the direct connectivity matters a ton. And so if you're directly connected and you have a keen understanding of each other and you have a currency that is yours to go back and forth with, there's tons that happen.
It gets back to the idea you mentioned at the beginning about the progression of getting to know a restaurant, and like maybe they recognize you on the 5th or 6th time you've been there, and then maybe they know your name, and maybe at some point you get a better table. Like that bond is exciting. And I think part of what's possible with Blackbird is like giving people an easier pathway to develop that.
100%. I mean, There's so many things. as you become a regular of a restaurant, you, in this very weird way, I think you become kind of a shareholder. Like you're very invested. Once you've become a regular, you are very invested in that restaurant.
Yes, you want it to work.
You want it to work. That restaurant loses its lease, you are back to square one. You got to rebuild.
Yeah.
So so the reason why that is a really powerful idea, and in the context of Fly and in the context of Blackbird, is because you could, as a restaurant regular, help the restaurant grow its audience.
How?
If you want to give your friends Fly to spend at that restaurant, right? Like
just at that restaurant, you can do that.
You can do that.
Yep.
That's something that you can't do today, but it's on the roadmap.
Yep.
You love the bolognese, gift the bolognese.
Oh, nice. And because it's integrated with the check and the check-in and and everything, like you can do that. Right. I love that. I mean, that's so intimate also and specific.
I guess the other thing is, when I say like restaurants are all these like little small players, restaurants are different than other categories of entertainment where you do have sort of like the concentration of the scale of the biggest players controls a lot of the industry, and it creates leverage opportunities. There really aren't big players in restaurants. There's a couple of
Really, right.
9-figure revenue businesses in restaurants, maybe $1 or $2 billion businesses in the United States, but that's it. And so restaurants historically have been beholden to entities like POS and like third-party delivery, and they don't have a lot of leverage with these companies. And that's another big part of Blackbird's thesis, is that has to shift.
And how does that shift in the Blackbird model?
Well, just as a simple example, the transaction cost, which has gone up and up and up because it's about Toast and it's about these legacy players, we're bringing that down.
Right.
And we're giving restaurants a lot more control of the rails.
Yep.
And so that's just one example, but also on the identity side, think about how hard it is for you to tell the restaurant the last 10 places you've been.
I wouldn't even know where to start.
You'd have to write it on a piece of paper.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Right. And in this kind of network that's a sort of identity network,
you check in,
history,
they get that.
Right. That's really cool. Or maybe you could even share elements of that in a way that helps tailor the experience.
And you could share elements, and you can decide what you want to share, and you could be incentivized to share them. The restaurant could say, we will pay 100 Fly.
Right. And because you're deeply integrated into the payments and the sort of loyalty and value stack, basically, that's one of the cool things about crypto, but also just about digital money in general, is that you can start to play with that and expose surface area for the restaurants to play with that. Which reminds me, the other thing I wanted to ask you was, I think one of the things that's really interesting about Blackbird, it's really a consumer app, right? Anybody who downloads it's going to download and be like, oh, this is like a buttery, like fully dope consumer app. It doesn't feel like some weird crypto thing. So you've managed to kind of take advantage of some superpowers that you get from crypto, while also kind of keeping it like under the hood a little bit. And I think that's interesting. And I think we're at a time where that's maybe an emerging pattern of some kind. And how have you thought about that as part of like product design and, expressing the value proposition here?
I think luckily I came to crypto late. And so I didn't really, when we started Blackbird, I didn't have deep experience with crypto as a consumer. And so for that reason, it's always felt like infra to me.
Right.
And that's how we use it.
Right. As opposed to something in and of itself.
Yeah.
Well, Blackbird is dope. It's an amazing product. I really hope it accomplishes or helps accomplish the goal that you've been pursuing for a long, long time, which is to bring people in restaurants closer together to make the business work better. I'm using it all the time, and it feels awesome to like start to have that connection, and I think it's going to grow. From here, as you look out towards like what's next and what you hope to accomplish, like the adjacent possible of right now, what's most exciting to you, or what kinds of things are you looking at?
I mean, obviously AI, everyone is thinking about AI and how that starts to play in anything. I think the interesting opportunity for Blackbird and AI and for restaurants and AI is that a big part of the struggle with marketing for restaurants historically has been the resources to figure it out.
Yep.
There aren't marketers at every restaurant.
Right. And it's like content production, distribution, like scaling up the process, right? Knowing what
Restaurants
what
don't
to
have
do.
CMOs.
Right.
Restaurants don't have marketing directors. They sometimes have a social media person. You know? It's just they're not resourced. So I think there's definitely something that we have to look at closely around how does AI become a real tool for audience growth for the restaurant, and how do we take what we know about customers and about restaurants and what data we have and point those at AI models to.
Yeah, and if you think about AI as a tool and a force that does a lot of things, but one of the things is it allows for efficiency in things that were hard to make efficient previously in business processes. And if there are elements of that in the restaurant business where margins are thin, staffing is tight, everyone's focused on doing the main thing, not the other 5 things. It makes sense that there should be opportunities for this to be a big unlock across the whole sector, and then maybe delivered through platforms like Blackbird.
Definitely.
Well, I think that is a long story, and what I love about it is that it's really the same idea all the way through, and it's gone through multiple phases, and it's also clear that there are multiple phases ahead. The job is not done.
The job is not anywhere near done.
Are you energized to keep pursuing this for the next 20, 25 years?
I'm ready to rock, man.
Let's go.
I mean, let's go. We have work to do.
All right. Thanks, Ben. That was really, really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.